I want to talk about evidence, and I want to read off what is the requirement for getting an A in the evidence category for the MLA paper. So this says, evidence provided is quoted and formatted correctly. Evidence clearly and logically connects to the paper's analysis of accuracy. Evidence is derived directly from the sources cited. This is the part I want to really focus on. The paper engages with sources in a way that goes beyond finding articles simply as agreement with accuracy. I want to talk a little more about that. And then, of course, papers with no quoted material cannot score in this range. So let's take a look at what this part of the evidence section in the A category of the rubric means. The paper engages with sources. That means that you are, quoting, paraphrasing, putting source material, whether that's from your primary or your secondary source, in your paper, and reading and commenting on, engaging with the sources in a way that goes beyond, so like does more than just finding articles to agree with accuracy. Okay, so I'm going to show you an example of what it looks like when a student only just finds articles that agree with accuracy, as opposed to when a student engages with sources, analyzes sources, and really works to do the work themselves. Because that is what it's going to come down to, is did you just quote other people's work and let that speak for your claim? Or did you make the claim and tell me the claim yourself? Okay, so I created two paragraphs. One of the paragraphs, paragraph 1, is presenting someone else's analysis. This is where you would not score in the A category of evidence, because if all of your paragraphs looked like this, then your evidence really is just making your argument for you, and you're not really getting involved with that evidence, okay? And you'll notice the difference here. So I'm going to highlight and read this first paragraph, which is something I don't want you to do or only do in your paper. I'm going to read through it, and then I'm going to comment on it. Gray's Anatomy downplays the amount of paperwork involved in medicine. According to Kelsey Calderon, doctors spend a majority of their time, drumroll please, filling out paperwork. Calderon explains that only 25% of a surgeon's day is with patients, which is not what is depicted on Gray's Anatomy. She writes, even while in the examination room with a patient, a doctor spends on average of 37% of that time filling out papers while diagnosing the patient's illness. Clearly, Gray's Anatomy does not show what it's really like when it comes to paperwork. According to Dr. Saltz, the amount of paperwork and administrative work everyone has to do in a hospital these days is not accurately portrayed because it's boring. It's safe to say that the show does not accurately portray the more mundane side of the career, and that a lot of the work we see doctors doing on Gray's Anatomy is actually work that is done by nurses, probably while doctors are doing paperwork. Okay, so I want to talk about why this paragraph is less effective than the one that I'm going to read. What this paragraph is doing is giving an analysis of the show without actually analyzing the show, especially with source number 2 here from Dr. Saltz. We can see that this source was quoted from an article titled, Is Gray's Anatomy Accurate? And we see that the author of this article is saying, no, it's not accurate in the, under the topic of paperwork. So here we've got a good source, a source that might help our readers believe that our argument is true, especially if we're going to argue that Gray's Anatomy is not accurate. But it's a source that's doing the work for us. The biggest issue that we see is that we don't have anywhere in this paragraph that's actually spending any time analyzing our primary source, Gray's Anatomy. So you see some notes where I said, This is not depicted on Grey's Anatomy. Just come right out and make the claim. Grey's Anatomy does not show what it's really like, but nowhere in this paragraph am I coming and saying, here, let me take you to Grey's Anatomy. Let me quote Grey's Anatomy. Let me describe what I'm seeing on screen in Grey's Anatomy and really show it to you and then compare to what it's like. We want to see that. A really good paper is not simply going to find sources that already make your claim for you. You can definitely include a source or two like that in your paper. In fact, you'll remember that I ask for one of those on your annotated bibliography, but you don't want the majority of your sources. You don't even want half of your sources to be that that type of text, one that's already basically answering your thesis statement, because you'll run the risk of not having effective evidence. So let's take a look at what it might look like if you had a paragraph that's doing more analysis. And I'll say here that I wrote this quickly, and I think I could have gone into even more analysis and depth in terms of presenting Grey's Anatomy. So we're getting kind of like maybe an A-B+ look at a more effective paragraph with analysis, but I'm going to talk about kind of the difference that we see here. And you should start to notice that when you look at this paragraph, you see the reflection of that comparative analysis structure that I've already outlined. You'll see it here in this paragraph. Okay, so again, I'm going to read it and then I'm going to talk about the difference here. Grey's Anatomy downplays the amount of paperwork involved in medicine. In Grey's Anatomy, we see a lot of different duties of surgeons, talking to patients, scrubbing in, performing surgeries, researching, and even studying for exams. However, one of the few tasks we see surgeons doing is charting and paperwork. Viewers see interns in multiple scenes carrying, memorizing, and reading from charts, and on occasion doctors are standing behind a computer. However, most of these scenes are staged in order to present a case or host a personal conversation. For example, in Season 1, Episode 1, we see Miranda Bailey greet her interns while holding what looks like a medical chart. She makes 1 or 2 marks on the chart, but never spends any amount of significant time working on that paperwork. And later we see Dr. Shepard holds a chart while talking with Meredith in the stairwell. But in the show, the doctors tend to read from charts more than write on them. Some unknowing viewer may get the inaccurate impression that doctors don't need to fill out very many forms. One study, however, found that doctors actually spend 49.2% of their time doing paperwork. If Grey's Anatomy accurately portrayed this fact of a doctor's life, then almost half of each episode would depict Meredith and her intern friends charting and signing their names and initials. Grey's Anatomy does an effective job at reminding viewers that paperwork is involved, but it does not actively show the extent of that paperwork in the daily life of doctors and surgeons. Okay, so again, I want to talk specifically about how this is structured differently and how that different structure helps to lend itself toward better evidence and better analysis. The evidence also makes a difference too, though. Okay, so like I said before, in our first paragraph, I don't give you much of anything in terms of analyzing Grey's Anatomy. I don't show you any kind of scenery from Grey's. I don't quote any dialogue, nothing like that. But I do that in the second paragraph, where I'm working to try and be better at presenting my own analysis. So I'm going to the show, I'm identifying, like, here's what I see on my screen. Miranda Bailey is writing in her chart. Dr. Shepard is holding it while he's talking to Meredith. I'm trying to kind of analyze and say, okay, here's what this kind of suggests. If I was a viewer, if I knew nothing about doctors, I might think that, you know, they have charts already made for them and they don't have to do any paperwork or anything along those lines. That's the kind of work I want to see. I want to see in your paper, in your sample paragraphs even, I want to see you pointing to the show or the movie, pointing to that primary source and identifying, you know, here's what I see and here's the impression I get, and then moving on to using your secondary sources and your secondary evidence to kind of back up whether that is an accurate reflection of the career or not. And so here I've quoted very minimally, but I've quoted from a source. This source didn't have anything to do with Grey's Anatomy. Instead of searching for an article that says, does Grey's Anatomy accurately portray paperwork, I searched for an article that says, how much paperwork do doctors have to do? So I want to be the one to make the connection between what I see and the evidence I find. I don't want my sources to already have made that connection, because that's, while you can use those sources and while they can be helpful, the more of those sources that you have, the more likely you're going to skip over the analysis yourself and end up with a lower score on the paper because you're not doing the hard work of making a comparison. I think that that's also, and I think this will be the last thing I say, but I think that that's also why, I have a lot of students who are concerned, well, what if I can't find any sources that are exactly about the argument I want to make? Well, that's really good if you can't find sources exactly about the argument you want to make, or that are making exactly the argument you want to make, because if you found those sources, and the more sources you find that are already doing your job, then, well, one, your job becomes pointless. So many people have already discussed it that there's nothing else to say. But two, their voices are going to rule over your voice, and that's not what you want. You want to be more in control of the research and of presenting the research. And a paragraph like paragraph number 2 here does that better, because you are analyzing the show and then you are comparing the reality to the show, as opposed to finding a source that has already done that for you. This is easy to write. The first paragraph is easy to write. The second paragraph takes much more time, but the first paragraph is not really the best type of writing. And so again, like I said in the beginning, I want you to apply this idea to anything that you're tasked to do in the future, especially if it involves analysis. Research papers are not supposed to be regurgitations of research that you've found. That's actually just called a literature review, and a lot of research papers have them, but if you ever go and get like a master's degree or something like that, something further higher, maybe even when you're working on your final paper in your capstone course for your bachelor's program, you might be asked to begin with, well, what have other people said about this? And now end your paper with, well, where's your voice? Maybe the first 5 pages is a review of the literature that's already been written, and then the next 10 to 20 pages is your new idea as it relates to the old idea. But it's never going to be, especially the further you get in school, it's never going to just be do research that simply just regurgitates ideas that you found from other people. That's not the best type of research to do, unless that's, you're doing some kind of, again, literature review or summary of work or something like that. So anyway, I hope that this makes sense. I hope that you can see the difference here between a paragraph presenting someone else's analysis and a paragraph that's really working to do your own analysis. However, if you guys have any questions, please let me know.